The box arrived on a Monday. Mondays are unremarkable in my life. Work, bills, dinner alone, but this one was different. The deliver man, a wiry figure with hollow eyes, didn't say much when he handed me the crate, except for a mumbled good luck before disappearing down the driveway. The package was unexpected. I'd never been close to my family, much less my great-grandfather, a man whose name I barely recognized when the lawyer called a week ago. "He's left you an heirloom," the lawyer had said. A clock. That was all I needed to know, enough to assume it was something dusty and useless, a trinket better left in a thrift shop. The crate sat in my living room for hours, daring me to open it. I couldn't say why I hesitated. There was something about the wood darker than it should have been, as though it had soaked up centuries of oil and sweat. When I finally pried it open, I half expected a swarm of bugs to erupt from the seal. Instead, there was only the clock. It was beautiful, too beautiful. The kind of craftsmanship that felt out of place in a world of factory line perfection. Brass gears gleamed behind an ornate glass face, its edges etched with symbols I couldn't identify. The frame was polished walnut, its surface strangely unmarked by time. The hands pointed to midnight, frozen in eternal stillness. And hanging from the side was a delicate winding key, attached by a chain that swayed faintly as though it had been disturbed. A note was tucked into the corner of the box. The paper felt brittle, and the ink looked like it had been scrawled by an unsteady hand. "To my bloodline, this clock is not a gift. It is a burden. Time is not yours to command." The words stirred something deep in my gut, a primal unease. I wanted to throw the clock away, but I couldn't. It didn't feel right. It didn't feel safe. I set it on the mantel, thinking that would be the end of it. That night, sleep eluded me. My dreams were fragmented, a kaleidoscope of gears turning and shadows moving, whispers threading through the darkness. When I woke, my heart was pounding, and the first thing I saw was the clock, its face illuminated faintly by the dawn light. I told myself I wouldn't touch it, but by the end of the day, the key was in my hand. The key was heavier than it looked, its metal cool against my palm. I hesitated for what felt like hours before inserting it into the clock side. The mechanism resisted at first, grinding as though it hadn't been wound in centuries. With a deep breath, I gave it one solid twist. The clock roared to life. Its ticking was immediate and unnatural, too loud, too slow. The hands moved, but not forward. They crawled backward, their motion smooth and deliberate, as though they had always been meant to defy the flow of time. And then the memories began to slip. At first, it was small things. I couldn't remember what I'd eaten that morning, though I was certain I had cooked something. Then came the faces. My neighbor, what was his name? I had spoken to him just yesterday. Or was it last week? I stumbled to the couch, clutching my head as though that could keep my thoughts from spilling out. The air around me felt thick, pressing against my chest, and the ticking of the clock grew louder, faster. I turned to it, ready to smash the damn thing, but froze. The room wasn't my living room anymore. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing dark stains that oozed downward like tar. Shadows crept across the floor, slow and deliberate, pooling in corners and stretching toward the clock. And the smell, metallic and sharp like old blood. A vision erupted before my eyes, vivid and undeniable. I saw a man kneeling in the dirt, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. Another man stood behind him, holding a spade. The first blow was quick, a sickening crunch that echoed through the silence. The image flickered, replaced by another. A woman standing in a darkened room, her hands clutching a knife. Her gaze was fixed on the figure lying motionless at her feet. The visions came faster, overlapping until I couldn't tell where one ended and the next began. Each was soaked in violence, betrayal, and desperation, their edges blurred like old film reels burning out. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I was back in my living room, gasping for air. The clock's pendulum swung in perfect rhythm, its hands still moving backward. A single whisper filled the room, low and raspy, spoken in a language I didn't recognize. But I understood its meaning. Return to the circle. Time is waiting. The whisper lingered long after it should have faded, wrapping itself around me like a cold fog. My hands trembled as I backed away from the clock, its relentless ticking filling the room. I thought I could escape it, get some air, think clearly, but when I opened the front door, I found only darkness. Not night, just darkness. The porch, the street, the world beyond my home had been swallowed whole. There was no wind, no stars, no sound except the clock's mocking rhythm. My heart thundered in my chest as I closed the door. The idea that the clock could somehow change the world outside was absurd, but the evidence was right there. Nothingness beyond the threshold. I had to know what I was dealing with. Grabbing my phone, I started researching the clock, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain its power. Hours passed as I combed through antique forums, obscure history websites, and even occult message boards. Every search led me in circles, frustration gnawing at me, until I stumbled upon a single thread buried in the depths of an old discussion group. Thread title: The Curse of Reversing Time. User: Anonymous Clockwork. If you found this clock, I'm sorry. It isn't just an object. It's a gateway, a prison, and a predator. The backward ticking erases you piece by piece. It feeds on your past to reveal truths you're not meant to know. The post went on to describe the visions I had seen, the violence, the betrayals. Each story was tied to someone in the poster's family. The thread ended abruptly, with one final, chilling line. Someone must pay the debt. That's how it ends. My stomach twisted as I scrolled through the comments, but the thread had been inactive for years. There was no one to reach out to for help, no way to verify the claims. The ticking grew louder, pulling me back to the living room. I didn't want to look at the clock, but it demanded my attention. The pendulum's sway was hypnotic, and the hands had nearly reached the 12 again, moving steadily backward. That's when I saw it, the reflection. In the glass face of the clock, something moved behind me. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of the light. It was a figure, twisted and hollow, with empty sockets where its eyes should have been. My breath caught as I spun around, but the room was empty. Empty, except for the clock's reflection. In it, the figure remained closer now, staring at me through the glass. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but I knew they were meant for me. "Stop," I whispered. My voice was barely audible, but the clock heard. The pendulum halted mid-swing, its hands freezing in place. The air grew heavy, and the lights flickered as the figure in the reflection smiled. An impossible, grotesque expression that split its face unnaturally wide. And then the clock struck 12. The chime wasn't a sound. It was a sensation, a jarring wave that rippled through me, dragging me under. My vision blurred, and I found myself standing in a different room. It was familiar, yet wrong, like walking into a memory twisted by time. The wallpaper was faded, the furniture older, the air thick with the scent of mildew. A woman sat in the corner, her face buried in her hands as she sobbed. I tried to move toward her, to speak, but my body refused to obey. Her head snapped up, and her eyes met mine. They weren't just filled with pain. They were accusing, as though I had wronged her in some unforgivable way. "Why didn't you stop him?" she whispered. Before I could respond, the scene dissolved, replaced by another, a man dragging a struggling figure into a shallow grave. His face was obscured, but I felt an unbearable familiarity, as though I knew him. I didn't know him. It was me. The visions blurred together, a cacophony of screams, betrayal, and blood. Faces I didn't recognize. Faces that somehow felt connected to me, flashed before my eyes. Each one asked the same question, their voices overlapping in a deafening roar. "Why didn't you stop it?" When I came to, I was back in my living room, sprawled on the floor. My head pounded, and my mouth tasted of ash. The clock's hands had reset, frozen at midnight once more. But the ticking continued. The room felt alive that night, buzzing with an energy I couldn't name. The clock's ticking filled every corner, its rhythm twisting into something uneven, like a heartbeat that had learned to lie. I sat on the couch, staring at it, wondering if I was losing my mind. The reflection in the glass, no longer showed my living room, but instead a flickering sequence of places and faces. A cabin bathed in moonlight, its windows shattered. A man in an old-fashioned suit standing at a crossroads, his shadow stretching unnaturally long. A woman clutching a bundle to her chest as blood dripped down her arms. And always the whisper, "Return to the circle. Time is waiting." It was late, but sleep wasn't an option. Not with the visions, the ticking, the weight of the air pressing down on me. I grabbed a notebook and began writing everything I could remember. Every detail of the visions, every fleeting thought about the clock. But the words came out wrong. The more I wrote, the less sense it made. My own handwriting twisted into jagged shapes, foreign letters that I didn't recognize. Pages filled with symbols, spirals, and lines that seemed to move when I looked away. When I stopped, my hand cramped, and the whispers grew louder. I threw the notebook aside and turned back to the clock. "Is this what you want?" I shouted. My voice echoed, hollow and fragile, in the silent room. "Do you want me to lose my mind? To join whatever this is?" The clock responded, not in words, but in action. Its hands began spinning faster, backward and backward until they blurred. The pendulum swung violently, and the air around me seemed to warp. I felt myself being pulled toward it, though my body didn't move. It was like gravity itself had shifted, centering on that cursed thing. The room around me faded, replaced by another vision. I was standing in a circle. A perfect ring of stones surrounded me, each one carved with the same strange symbols that had filled my notebook. The ground beneath my feet was cold and damp, and a thick mist hung in the air. Figures stood at the edge of the circle, their faces obscured by hoods. Their whispers filled the space, blending into a chorus that chilled me to my core. One of them stepped forward, holding something, a book, its leather cover cracked and worn. They opened it, and as their fingers traced the pages, I felt the words they read etching themselves into my mind. "You are bound," they intoned. Their voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It was timeless. By blood and by time, you are bound to the circle. You will bear the debt. The vision twisted, spinning around me until the hooded figures melted into shadows and the stone circle crumbled away. I was back in my living room, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. The clock was silent. For the first time since I'd wound it, it had stopped ticking. Its hands rested at midnight, the pendulum still as death. I wanted to believe it was over, that the vision had broken whatever curse tied me to this thing. But then the whispers started again. They weren't coming from the clock anymore. They were inside me. The whispers grew louder with each passing hour. At first, they were like faint echoes in the back of my mind, words I couldn't quite understand. But they gained strength quickly, rising from a soft murmur to a cacophony of overlapping voices. Each one spoke in a language that was both alien and eerily familiar, as though my brain recognized the rhythm, but not the meaning. The clock sat in its usual place, silent and still. Its frozen hands mocked me, pointing to midnight like a silent reminder that time no longer belonged to me. I tried to drown out the voices, music, television, even the roar of the vacuum cleaner. Nothing worked. The whispers simply grew louder, matching the volume of whatever noise I created. They were relentless, clawing at the edges of my sanity, demanding to be heard. By the third day, I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. My reflection in the bathroom mirror was a stranger's, a pale, gaunt face with dark hollows under the eyes. The whispers had started to form words I could almost understand, fragments of sentences that hinted at something vast and incomprehensible. The circle is unbroken. The debt must be paid. Return, or they will come for you. It wasn't until the fourth day that I realized the voices weren't entirely in my head. I'd been pacing the house, my mind too restless to focus on anything. The whispers filled every corner of my thoughts, and I barely noticed when I passed the clock. But as I stepped into the kitchen, a shadow moved in my peripheral vision. I froze. Slowly, I turned to look back at the clock. The glass face had gone dark. No reflection, no visible hands. just a void that seemed to swallow the light. And in that void, a shape was forming. It started as a faint outline, like smoke curling into a figure, but it grew more defined with every second, solidifying into a humanoid form. Its features were indistinct, blurred as though it were covered in a thin veil. But its eyes, empty, hollow sockets, stared directly at me. I backed away, my breath hitching as the figure pressed itself against the inside of the glass. It raised a hand, its fingers impossibly long and spindly, and tapped against the surface. Tulp! Tap! Tulp! The sound echoed in my ears, louder than it should have been. "Leave me alone," I whispered, though my voice trembled. The figure tilted its head, as if curious. Then it smiled. The grin stretched too wide, splitting its face in two, revealing rows of jagged teeth that gleamed like shards of glass. The whispers surged, louder and more insistent than ever. "Return to the circle. Time is waiting. Pay the debt." The figure raised its other hand, and the void behind it began to shift. Scenes played out in the darkness, flashes of memories that weren't mine. A family sitting at a long wooden table, their faces gaunt and grim. A child weeping in the corner of a dimly lit room, clutching a pocket watch. A shadowy group gathered in a clearing, their chants rising in a language that made my skin crawl. And then I saw myself, not as I was, but as I could be, standing in that same clearing, surrounded by hooded figures. My face was blank, emotionless, as I held the clock aloft. The scene froze for a moment, then shattered like glass, leaving me staring at my own terrified reflection. The glass face of the clock was clear again, and the figure was gone. But the whispers remained, louder than ever. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the clock and hurled it across the room. It hit the wall with a sickening crunch, the glass shattering into 100 pieces. For a moment, the whispers stopped, and I thought I was free. But then the air in the room shifted. It grew heavier, colder, pressing against me like an unseen hand. The shards of glass began to move, sliding across the floor toward the clock's broken frame. They reassembled themselves, the pieces clicking into place with an unnatural precision. The clock was whole again, and the ticking resumed. The room felt colder now, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. The clock sat exactly where it had always been, untouched, as though I hadn't just smashed it into the wall. Its face gleamed in the faint light, the hands frozen at midnight. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers had quieted, but they hadn't disappeared. They hovered on the edge of my thoughts, a constant, insidious presence that gnawed at my sanity. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice trembling. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the pendulum began to swing again. The ticking resumed, louder and slower than before, each sound reverberating through my skull. The reflection in the clock's glass face shimmered, distorting the room around it. My own image stared back at me, but something was wrong. My reflection wasn't moving as I was. It was staring directly at the clock, its expression one of blank resignation. Then it spoke. "You can stop this." I froze. The voice wasn't mine, but it came from my reflection. It was calm, emotionless, and utterly alien. "Stop what?" I whispered. The reflection tilted its head, its lips curling into a faint smile. "The debt. The circle. You've already begun, but you don't have to finish." "What do you mean? What debt? What circle?" The ticking grew louder, faster, as though urging me forward. My reflection's smile widened, and its voice became a whisper that echoed in my mind. "Someone must pay. It doesn't have to be you." My stomach churned. The implication was clear, but I refused to believe it. "I'm not sacrificing anyone," I said, my voice rising. "I'm not like whatever this is." The reflection laughed, a hollow, mocking sound that sent shivers down my spine. The room around me seemed to ripple, and the whispers returned, overlapping in a deafening chorus. "Return to the circle. Time is waiting. Pay the debt." The glass face of the clock darkened, and the figure returned. This time, it wasn't alone. Shadows gathered behind it. forming a line of indistinct shapes. Each one seemed to carry a weight, a history, that pressed down on me with unbearable force. I recognized some of them: the man with the spade, the weeping child, the woman with blood-streaked hands. They stared at me with hollow eyes, their expressions void of emotion. One of the figures stepped forward, and the shadows seemed to peel away from it like smoke. It was my great-grandfather. I'd never met him, but I knew without a doubt it was him. His face was lined with age, his eyes sunken and weary, but there was something else, a glint of despair, of guilt. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, the whisper spoke for him. "You inherited the clock. The burden is yours now." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want any of this." "Neither did I." His voice finally broke through, weak but steady. He raised a hand and pointed at the clock. "The circle demands a life. If you don't offer one, it will take yours and more." I stumbled back, my mind reeling. "No," I said again, louder this time. "There has to be another way." My great-grandfather's face twisted with sorrow. "I try to find one, but the circle is unbroken. It binds us all." The shadows began to move, swirling around him like a living storm. His figure dissolved into the darkness, and the glass face of the clock cleared once more. My own reflection stared back at me, pale and terrified. The ticking stopped, and in the silence, a single word echoed in my mind: "Choose." The silence that followed the word "choose" was more deafening than the whispers had been. I stood frozen, staring at my reflection in the clock's glass face. It was no longer my reflection. It was me, but older, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a face weathered by suffering. It mouthed a single word: "Choose." I shook my head violently, backing away. My legs hit the edge of the couch, and I collapsed onto it. My thoughts raced, chasing answers that weren't there. How could I choose? Who could I possibly know? No, I couldn't even entertain the thought. The whispers began again, faint at first, but growing stronger. They didn't feel like intrusions anymore. They felt like part of me. "You cannot escape. Time takes its due. Pay the debt." I grabbed my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. I needed a tether to reality, something to pull me back from the edge. But when I unlocked the screen, I froze. My call log was empty. No contacts. No messages. Not even my own number displayed on the phone. It was blank, as though I had never existed. Frantically, I went through my photos, my apps, my social media. Everything was gone. My stomach churned, while rising in my throat as I realized the truth. The clock wasn't just taking my memories, it was erasing me. I screamed in frustration, hurling the phone across the room. It shattered against the wall, but even as it broke, the sound was swallowed by the clock's relentless silence. A cold draft swept through the room, and the air grew heavy with the scent of old wood and metal. When I looked up, the room was different. The walls were darker, the furniture older, and the clock was gone. In its place stood the figure from the glass. No longer confined, it loomed before me, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. It was impossibly tall, its limbs long and spindly, its face split by that grotesque grin. Shadows writhed around it, curling and twisting as if alive. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. The figure tilted its head, as though amused. "I am the circle," it said, its voice a guttural rasp that echoed inside my skull. "What do you want from me?" It took a step closer, and I felt the weight of its presence press down on me like a physical force. "I want what is owed. The debt must be paid." "I can't. Choose," it interrupted. Its voice was sharper now, more forceful. "Choose, or the circle will choose for you." The walls around me began to shimmer, and the room melted away, replaced by a vision of my family. My wife, smiling as she played with our daughter in the yard. My mother, standing in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour as she baked. My best friend, laughing over beers on the porch. The vision twisted, darkened. I saw them one by one, their faces pale, their eyes hollow, their mouths stretched into unnatural grins. The figure loomed closer. One of them must take your place, or they will all be consumed. No, I shouted, tears streaming down my face. You can't do this. The figure leaned in, its grin widening. It is not I who does this. It is you, your bloodline, your choices. I collapsed to my knees, sobbing. The weight of the decision crushed me, but I couldn't bring myself to speak the words. I couldn't condemn someone I loved to this eternity. The figure straightened, its grin fading. Very well, it said. You refuse to choose. Then the clock will decide. The room exploded into darkness, and the last thing I saw was the clock's face reappearing in the void, its hands spinning wildly backward. I woke to the sound of the clock chiming. It wasn't the soft, melodic chime you'd expect from a grandfather clock. It was sharp, jarring, like a metal blade dragged across stone. Each chime reverberated through my body, rattling my bones. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my living room anymore. The air was dense with mist, the ground beneath me cold and damp. I recognized the place immediately, the circle. The stones loomed around me, ancient and weathered, their carvings glowing faintly in the low light. The figure stood at the center, surrounded by the same shadowy forms I'd seen before. They moved like smoke, their shapes flickering and shifting, but their hollow eyes never left me. The circle has chosen, the figure said, its voice echoing through the mist. No, I whispered, my throat dry and raw. You can't. The figure raised a spindly hand, and I fell silent. The shadows parted, revealing another figure standing on the edge of the circle. My breath caught in my chest. It was my mother. She stood frozen, her face pale and her expression blank, as if she were sleepwalking. Her hands hung limply at her sides, and her eyes stared straight ahead, unseeing. Stop! I shouted, scrambling to my feet. Take me. I'll stay. Just leave her alone. The figure tilted its head, its grin returning. You had your chance to choose. I rushed toward her, but the moment I crossed the boundary of the circle, I hit an invisible barrier. The force knocked me back, leaving me sprawled on the ground. The figure's laughter filled the air, a deep, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. Please, I begged, tears streaming down my face. Please don't take her. She's done nothing wrong. The figure ignored me. It raised both hands, and the shadows surged forward, wrapping around my mother like a living shroud. Her face contorted in pain, but no sound escaped her lips. I pounded on the barrier, screaming her name, but it was no use. The shadows consumed her, pulling her into the center of the circle. Her body twisted, her features dissolving into the darkness until she was gone. And then the clock chimed again. This time, the sound was different, softer, almost mournful. The air grew still, the shadows retreating into the stones. The figure turned to me, its grin fading. The first toll has been paid, it said. I collapsed to the ground, sobbing. My mother's absence hung in the air like a weight, crushing me under its enormity. The figure stepped closer, towering over me. You will return to the clock, it said. The debt remains. Before I could respond, the world around me dissolved into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my living room. The clock sat on the mantel, its pendulum swinging gently. The hands had stopped moving, frozen once again at midnight. But something was different. The photo of my mother that had always hung on the wall was gone. So were the memories. I couldn't remember her face, her voice, or even her name. All that remained was the hollow ache of her absence. The days that followed were a blur of grief and dread. My mother's absence was a black hole in my mind, pulling everything else into its void. Every time I tried to recall her face, I was met with static, a blank, unyielding emptiness. The only thing I could feel was the crushing guilt, the knowledge that I had failed her. The clock loomed over me, its silent presence more menacing than ever. Its hands were still frozen at midnight, but the pendulum swayed lazily, as if mocking my despair. I couldn't stay in the house anymore. It felt like a tomb, each room echoing with whispers I couldn't quite hear. So I left. I drove aimlessly, needing to escape, but not knowing where to go. The roads were eerily empty, the landscape shifting in ways that didn't make sense. Landmarks appeared where they shouldn't, trees bent unnaturally, and the sky seemed darker than it should have been, even in the middle of the day. The radio in my car crackled, the static giving way to faint voices. The circle is unbroken. Return. Time is waiting. I turned the dial, desperate for anything else, but the voices only grew louder. I yanked the knob to turn the radio off, but it wouldn't budge. The car itself felt wrong. The air too cold, the steering wheel too slick. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There, in the back seat, was the figure. It grinned at me, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. Before I could react, the car swerved violently, as though the wheel had a mind of its own. I struggled to regain control, but it was no use. The world outside the windshield twisted and blurred, and the car came to an abrupt stop. When I looked up, I was back at the house. I didn't want to go inside, but something was pulling me toward it. The front door was already open, the faint ticking of the clock spilling out like a siren's call. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me. The house was darker than I remembered, the walls warped and stained. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor, and the air smelled of damp earth and decay. The clock sat on the mantel, glowing faintly. Its face had changed. Instead of numbers, there were symbols, ancient, unreadable, but somehow familiar. The pendulum swung faster now, each movement accompanied by a faint hum that vibrated through my chest. I approached it cautiously, my heart pounding in my ears. As I reached out, the glass face darkened, and the figure appeared again. This time, it spoke directly to me, its voice a guttural rasp. "The circle remains incomplete," it said. "One toll is not enough." I clenched my fists, anger rising in me for the first time since this nightmare began. "What do you want from me? Haven't you taken enough?" The figure tilted its head, its grin widening. "You are bound to the circle. Time will take what it is owed, but you may lessen the toll." "How?" The shadows around the clock shifted, forming a shape, a woman's face. It was my wife. "No," I whispered, stepping back. The figure ignored me. "Offer her. The debt will be settled." "No," I shouted, my voice breaking. "I won't do it." The figure leaned closer, its hollow eyes burning into mine. "Then the circle will take more. It will take all." The room trembled, the shadows growing darker and thicker. The walls groaned as the air became stifling, suffocating. I fell to my knees, the weight of the choice crushing me. My wife, my daughter, my friends. How could I sacrifice any of them? But if I did nothing, they would all be taken. The figure stood silently, waiting. The air was suffocating, thick with an unnatural weight that pressed down on my chest. The figure stood before me, its grin wide and unyielding, its hollow eyes burning into mine. "The debt must be paid," it rasped. "Choose, or the circle will take all." I sat there, trembling, staring into the void of its gaze. My wife's face flickered in the shadows behind it, her expression serene yet lifeless. I thought of my daughter, her laughter, her small hand in mine, her future stretching endlessly before her. The figure tilted its head, sensing my hesitation. "Every moment you delay, more will be taken." The room darkened further, the shadows shifting to show faces I didn't recognize, ancestors perhaps. Their eyes were sunken, their mouths twisted in silent screams. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices all demanding the same thing. "Choose." I can't," I stammered, tears streaming down my face. The figure stepped closer, the air around it growing colder. "Then they will all be lost." I stood, shaking, and turned toward the clock. Its hands were spinning wildly now, faster and faster, and the symbols on its face glowed with an otherworldly light. The pendulum swung furiously, each motion sending waves of energy through the room. There had to be another way. My gaze fell to the winding key, still hanging from the side of the clock. A desperate idea formed in my mind, reckless and possibly suicidal. If the clock controlled this curse, maybe I could break it. Maybe I could stop the circle from taking anyone else. Without thinking, I grabbed the key. The metal burned against my palm, but I held on, twisting it with all my strength. The clock groaned, its gears grinding as the hands slowed. The whispers reached a fever pitch, screaming inside my head, but I kept turning. The figure lunged toward me, its grin fading into a snarl. "Stop!" It roared, its voice shaking the very walls. I ignored it, twisting the key harder. The clock's face cracked, fractures spreading like spiderwebs across the glass. The shadows writhed violently, the faces within them twisting in agony. "You cannot break the circle," the figure howled. The pendulum stopped. The clock let out a deafening chime, and the entire room was consumed by blinding light. When the light faded, I was alone. The house was silent, the oppressive weight lifted. The clock lay in pieces on the floor, its gears scattered like broken bones. I collapsed onto the couch, my body trembling with exhaustion. The whispers were gone. The shadows vanished. For the first time in days, I felt free. But as relief washed over me, a nagging doubt crept in. I picked up my phone, desperate to check on my wife and daughter. The screen flickered, showing a single photo. The three of us smiling together. My chest tightened. Something was wrong. The photo was wrong. My wife's face was blurred, her features indistinct. My daughter was gone entirely, replaced by a blank void. The realization hit me like a blow. They were erased. The clock was gone, the circle broken, but the toll had been taken. Weeks have passed since that night, and I still don't know if I made the right choice. The world feels emptier now, quieter. People look through me, as though I'm a ghost walking among the living. Sometimes late at night, I hear it, the ticking, soft, distant, but unmistakable. I tell myself it's my imagination, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I know the truth. The clock is gone, but the circle is never truly broken. And time is waiting,